Hello everyone, welcome to another tutorial. This one is going to be on Render. This is going to be a quick start guide to get our web applications onto Render so we can actually see something and we can work with it. So Render is an online hosting tool, which is meant for hobbyists, students submitting assignments, as well as doing some basic prototyping. So it's not really meant for production-ready environments, although they have tiers that you need to pay for that have production-ready features. So in this tutorial, we're just going to play with the free tier and just make sure that we can get our web applications up and running. This is not meant to be a deep dive into web development. So if you're interested in Node.js or you're interested in a front-end framework, please take a look at one of our other videos. So the first thing we're going to need, diving right in, is we need a GitHub account. So I have a GitHub account here. You notice that I've already logged in. This GitHub account is Bobby Chan SFU. Notice that I don't have any repositories right now. I am going to clone one over from one of the template applications that I have. So the URL is given in the description below. And depending on the time that you're watching this, this might not be the URL anymore. So just take a look at the description below. So right now I'm going to bobbyctchan/276. Again, this may not be the right URL depending on the time that you're watching this video. All right, so notice that we have a template application. And the first thing we're going to do is fork this application into our repo. So I'm going to do fork, and you'll notice that it says, okay, where do you want to put this? I want to put it into this owner called Bobby Chan SFU, and I'm going to name the repository. Now, if you don't like the name 276, we can name it something else. I'm just going to name it CMPT 276, and I'm just going to make sure that this is checked off, main branch, because that's where our application is going. And this, if we click on create, is going to navigate us back to our repo. So our repo is now going to have a project called comp276, and it's going to have our code in there. Okay, so right now we have our project created on our repo, and what we want to do is pull it into our local working directory. What I mean by local directory is we can make changes to our app locally on our machine. We can run a mock server just to mimic the behavior of a real server, not to put it on the internet, but if we're happy with the functionality, we can push it back into our repo and our teammates can comment on it. GitHub repos is a good place where we can communicate with our teammates and look at different versions of our app. We use GitHub to organize ourselves into branches, maybe sub-teams, and in these branches, we can work on different features, and only one of these branches is going to be visible to the outside world, which is accessible from the internet. I'm going to have a video on this a little bit later on. All right, so the next step we're going to need, again, is to pull our work into our local machine. So I'm going to open up a terminal for that, and our terminal is right now, I'm going to go to my desktop. You can actually go, oh, it's already in the desktop. So you can go to any folder that you want. This is just going to be your working folder. I'm going to do a git clone. And if we go over to our code, it'll tell us that there is a link for our git clone. This URL is going to be the one that we're going to use to pull all of these files into our local machine. Now, by default, it's going to put it into a folder called CMPT276. It's going to name it the same thing as our project. If you don't want it to be named that, you can add another parameter here just to rename what the folder is. I'm just going to leave it as comp276. I'm pretty happy with that. So it's going to bring in all of the files. And now on our desktop, we are going to have this file called CMPT276. I'm going to jump in there just to let you know, just to let you see that we have some code that corresponds to what we're seeing here in our project. All right. So the next thing we'll do, you'll see our project now on our desktop. So I'm going to drag our folder into VS Code. And this is where we're going to do the majority of our work for development. So I want to show you a few things in this folder. So firstly, I want to open up our index.js. Our index.js is going to include the logic for running our server. So what this is all of basically the directions to run the server. So firstly, we're going to use this package called Express. And this Express package is something that somebody else has written that we want to bring into our application. It's very much like a library. And this Express application will allow us to be able to direct the server to actively listen for requests that are coming in from a client. So later on, when we actually put this online, this is the actual code that's going to run and be able to listen to any requests that are coming in and to be able to satisfy those requests with some response from the server. So there's a couple things I want you to see here. Firstly, we're running our Express app. And secondly, I want you to see that there is this variable called port. So a port is where our server is listening for the incoming requests. So there's an environment variable called PORT, all capital PORT. And whatever number that is, whatever it's been assigned, that is going to bring it into our application as a variable. And notice if we jump all the way down, this app.listen, so this app is our Express app, is listening to that port. And then it's consoling to the log. It's writing to the log that example app listening on port, and then it's going to write out that variable. All right, so in a second, we will actually make note of that. But for now, we should note that there is some port that we have to access this functionality on. All right, second thing we want to take a look is the template views. Now, the template views, look at this as dynamic views. So views that are generated dynamically. So we have this folder called views, and this is we're going to be using the view engine EJS. So notice that in our folder structure, we have views, and then there is this file called index.ejs. All right, so if we come down here in our code, you'll notice that there is on line 13 an app.get and then the root of the application. We are going to send a render command over to the index file. Now, the index file here is referring to the views, right? So it is actually referring to the index.ejs. All right, so we're going to render out the index file, and along with that, we are going to send some extra information. So this extra information is in the form of a JSON object. So we have the title attribute, which is called my app. Okay, we can add a lot more things to this, and throughout this tutorial, we're going to actually add a lot more things to be passed into certain endpoints. So that's the first thing, and we might as well take a look at our views. So if we take a look at index.ejs, you'll notice that this is really nothing more than just an HTML file. We have a body, we have h1, which we're actually printing out this title. Now this notation here is saying take title, whatever the attribute title is, and print that out. So in a second, we'll see what that is. And then we're going to print out hello world. So the last thing we should note is that there is this folder also called public. And what we're doing with public is that we're accessing our static files from public. Okay, so express.static is saying I'm going to redirect any static requests over to this folder called public. So whenever there's a static request coming in from a client, the server has a default location where they try to satisfy this request. So all this is saying in this case is that we have a default folder called public where we can look up our static resources. So static resources are things like CSS files, HTML files, JavaScript files, maybe some images or other media that you can put there, anything that doesn't change over time. I think that's all we really need to know about this application for now. We're actually going to go into a lot more detail about how Node works, and we'll come back to this application at that time. But for now, let's run this application. So we're going to bring up a terminal here. So on the Mac, Control and tilde key to bring up our terminal. And in our application, I'm going to run an npm install. Okay, now we can also run npm I for the same thing, just a shortcut. So this npm install is going to take all of the packages that I have. So if you take a look at package.json, all of these dependencies, it's going to download them and it's going to install them into our program so that it can run. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to Node as well. But all you have to know for now is that everything is installed properly, and now we're ready to run the application. I also want you to notice that we now have a folder called Node modules, right? So Node modules is the folder where all of these dependencies are going to sit. If we open up Node modules, you'll see that there's actually a lot of things going on in here, including this thing called Express that we're going to use as part of our application. So now it's ready to run. And the way that we're going to run this application is we're going to invoke Node index.js. Now I'm going to run this command and you'll notice that there's something wrong. So it says that example app listening on port. So you'll notice that this is exactly what's being printed out here. Example app listening on port. And then I need to regurgitate the port. But right now the port says undefined. And the reason is because in the local environment where I'm running it locally on the computer, there's no environment variable called port. Now remember I said earlier that there's this port variable that needs to be assigned to this variable called port. So what I need to do before I run this is I need to assign that port variable. So I'm going to do port equals, I'm just going to pick a number. Now, typical numbers are between 2000 and 10,000, right? So we can use any of these ports for development purposes. They really won't affect anything since they're only going to be used locally. So I'm going to listen for a port called 8000 locally on my machine, and I'm going to run node index.js. All right, so now you'll notice that it says example app running on port and then 8000. So now it's all ready. So now our server is running, but it is running on our local environment. Okay, and what that means is that we are running a application that kind of mimics a server. So we can send requests over to the server, but it's only going to happen locally. Okay, so everything happening right now is locally. And the server name by default is called localhost. And I'm going to go to localhost 8000. I'm going to go to slash. Now slash, notice that this is the root that I've defined. This is the root of the application. And in a later video, we're going to create many other roots on this application. So right now I'm just going to go to localhost 8000 and then slash, and you'll notice that it renders out this HTML file that we saw, right? It says hello world, and then there was a title called my app, if you remember that. So right now we're pretty happy with this application. Notice that we didn't actually change anything, right? We didn't add our own code. This is just how the default application works. The next thing that we need to do is we have this code on our repo. Okay, this is our repo and it's under a project called COM276. So I want to get all of this code and I want to put it onto render so that I'm not looking at it only locally, I'm looking at it on the internet. So after we put it on render, what we want to happen is that anywhere on the internet or anywhere I have a browser, I will be able to type in a URL and I will be able to see this thing, right? So if you go to another computer, right, and you type in localhost 8000, you will not see this application, right? You won't see this app running. It is only running locally. So the next thing we're going to need is we need to jump over to render. Okay, so go to render.com or go to dashboard.render.com and you're going to need to sign up for an account. If you don't have an account, you need to sign up. And I would just typically use my GitHub account for that, right? Because you'll see later on why, because we're going to connect our code on GitHub into our render project. So I've already signed up. So I'm just going to do a sign in to GitHub. And we're going to be redirected to this dashboard. There's a lot of things that we can play around with in render. Two things in particular that we're going to use in this video series is that we're going to use the web services as well as Postgres. Okay, Postgres is a database that we're going to touch on a little bit later in a later video. But right now, let's just create a new web service for this GitHub project. We have GitHub connected here. So if this is your first time running this, you will have to go to configure account. So you'll notice that we've already connected our account. This is our GitHub account. Mine is Bobby Chen SFU. If you don't have one configured, you will need to configure your account and you're going to need to make sure that it installs the render functionalities on GitHub. So what that allows is for render to be able to listen for your GitHub changes. Okay, so more on this on a later video. But for now, I only have one project. This is our COM276 project. So I'm going to do a connect. So I'm going to connect this project and it's going to ask us a few things. So pick a unique name for your web application. So I'm going to pick 276. Hopefully that's available to us. And we pick a region. So this is US West. This is pretty close to where I am. So I'm going to leave it at that. I have a main branch. And main branch, remember, is the one that it holds the main application. The root directory, we don't really need that. It is a node application and I'm going to run yarn. Now, running yarn is very similar to what we did before in our application. Remember, before in our application, we ran npm install. So running yarn is really the same as running npm install. It takes all of our dependencies and it installs it so that we can run an application. Now, the start command here is going to be node index.js. So just like what we ran here, right, node index.js, but notice that we don't need to include a port in this case. There is going to be a port given to us in the environment variable when render starts up your application. All right, so the next thing we need to ask, they're going to ask us is, what kind of tier do you want? Do you want the free tier or do you want something a little bit better than that? So I think for now, I'm going to stick with the free tier. It's pretty generous what they give you. So you get quite a bit of RAM, you get a shared CPU, but it is free. So the next thing we'll do is we're going to create our web service. And you'll notice that when we create the web service, we're going to be navigated to a page that's going to show us the progress. So right now, you see that we've started at 340 and this is actually going to take a while. So I'm going to pause the video. Actually, I'm going to speed up the video and I'm going to show you what the progress looks like. It's going to run a few executions on their end. And when it's ready to run, I will come back and I'll talk to you again. All right, so we're back. And if you take a look at the time, it's about 2 minutes that it takes to deploy the application. Notice that our output is example app listening on port 10,000. Now let's just go through a few things that this process went through. So first we fetch the packages. So this is analogous to, if you remember before, when we did the npm install, this brings in all the packages from the outside and it copies it to our local directory under a node modules folder. And then this application deploys itself. Okay, so it's deploying and then starting service with node index.js. That's what we did over here. And then now it says example app listening on port 10,000. All right, so now it's using an internal port, and this port ends up, it really doesn't matter what this port is, because later on, we'll find that this port is actually used only internally. So this number really doesn't matter. They've given us an environment variable, that's fine. All right, so don't be fooled at this point because render is actually still doing stuff in the background. So notice that there is still this toolbar that says in progress. So if we click over to events, right, it says first deploy started, and then it's still kind of working here. So if you take a look at events and you don't see that this app is successfully deployed, it is still not up and running. Okay, so just be a little bit patient. We have to wait a little bit, and this usually takes about 5 minutes if this is the first time that you're running. So I will come back and we will speed up the video one more time until everything is up and running. Okay, so we're back. It seems like everything is done now. So I'm going to click over to events. So notice that it says deploy live. So now it's deployed and now it's ready to be seen. So the URL that you're going to be given is up here. So you can click on this. This is comp276.onrender.com. Right? You're probably going to have a different name. And if we click on that, you'll see that this is the application that we're presented with. You'll also notice that this is the same application that we saw locally, but now it is online. So it's on the internet. So what that tells you is that in general, when we're developing, we're going to have two versions of this application. One, which we're developing locally, and it may not be working. There may be bugs associated with it. But once we've fixed all of those bugs, once we're ready to push it into production, we're going to put it into production. And in production is where everybody can see it. The internet can see it. So we're going to go through that process many, many times in this video. But in this video, I just wanted to give an introduction to that process, that workflow. And we're going to come back in our next video and start with HTML, and then we're going to write some back-end logic to incorporate into our web application. So I'll see you in the next video.